Hello, everyone. I hope you're well. Today's conversation is with Mike Levin. So, Mike's a developmental biologist, and his work is fascinating to say the least. And if you've sort of heard or encountered Mike's work before, I hope you can still enjoy this conversation. If you've not, then I think, yeah, you're kind of in for a treat because, and I don't mean that just in terms of this conversation. I mean, like, you're in for a treat having now discovered who Mike is. And I encourage you to go and listen to, yeah, there's many podcast conversations. Mike's done many lectures online, which you can listen to, and I'll link some of the papers I find particularly interesting. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. We kind of, yeah, we talk about Mike's work, but then the sort of perhaps more philosophical implications for it, and also what it might mean for self-organization, and sort of with regards to say mental health, and psychology. So towards the end of the conversation, but yeah, I hope you enjoy.
Great, yeah, excellent.
Nice. So yeah, Mike, I was going to sort of, well, actually, yeah, firstly, I think it makes sense to partly as well because this podcast is referred to, well, it's called This Mind of Ours. I think mind is a term which we can, like, colloquially, we sort of assume we're all on the same page. But actually, there's kind of many different ways people, some people it's around like, refer to sort of like awareness. For others, it's sort of like cognition. Um, Others perhaps more computationally, like think referring to sort of like the work of like Carl Friston and stuff, in like maybe even a self or any sort of self-organizing system is a mind. So how do you define mind, if that makes sense, or a mind?
Yeah. Well, let's take a step back and just ask what the utility of these definitions is, and what are they really, these definitions. So I take kind of an operationalist view that the point of all of these terms, like all the cognitive terms, things like alive, all of this, all these kinds of things, what they really pick out are sets of tools or approaches that you propose to use with a given system. So when you tell me that a system has a certain level of cognition or that it has a mind or whatever, what you're really telling me is you're proposing that that you're going to deploy tools that are used in behavior science and cognitive neuroscience and things like that, as opposed to other tools like physical rewiring, which you might use with a mechanical clock, or cybernetics and control theory, right? And so for me, this also, so all of these are operational terms. They're all
Okay.
interaction protocol claims. When you make a claim, I don't think any of these things are claims about what the system really is. I don't think there is really, anything really is anything. It's these are all different frames that different observers might take to interact with that system. And so, when you tell me that it has a mind, you're making you're making some claims about how you're going to be able to interact with it, and that means that in most of the time for these philosophical discussions, I'm less worried about the specifics of the of the definitions, because that's a scientific thing. We then, and I think this is really important, we can't arrive at any of these things through armchair speculation. You have to make very specific claims. I think it's capable of associative conditioning. I think it has a first person perspective. I think it's whatever you think it has, and then we do science to find out if that actually bears out via experiments. But the collection of these things, I often talk about as being a cognitive system.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, you make a point there, which I heard you made a point elsewhere, and I'm curious to sort of just unpack that a little bit more, which is this idea of, I mean, I think I have a sense as to what you're getting at, but we only ever have models. We only have. I think it was your conversation with. Is it Thomas Metzinger? Metzinger. It was on that for the Philosophy Babble channel anyway. But you were talking with him, and I think you made the point that we only ever have models, and you've just sort of referred to it there.
Sorry,
What
did you say models or modules? I couldn't hear.
models? We
Okay,
only ever model,
model.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I see. Well, and again, I don't think I'm saying anything new that hasn't been said a million times. Is that
Yes.
I don't, at least in normal scenarios, I don't think we have access to ground truth. I think we are looking at the world through a particular interface, which was the product of evolution and some constraints and some other
Right.
interesting
Right.
things. And that means that there are in fact, the vast majority of capabilities of how you're going to look at a system are not open to us. We have very narrow cognitive and sensory capabilities through which we see the world, and then we make sense of it. So it's a kind of a sense-making progress. Cognition, I think, is a sense-making
Mhm.
process, and it's very much like with the electromagnetic spectrum. Natively we are sensitive to a very thin slice of it, but
Mm.
with conceptual advances and then the tools that they enable, you can now interact with a lot more. And I think this is true as far as the mind blindness that we are all subject to, right? We find it very hard to see, for example, unconventional kinds of minds all around us, but we can improve using science and technology. We can improve, and we can see more. And we can develop interactions with them, and so on.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I suppose because what I think of when you speak there is this sort of reference to minds being elsewhere, and your work and my understanding, and please clarify for me if I've misunderstood this, though, is that your work sort of speaks to this idea that minds, in terms of like the scale of analysis, goes much lower than perhaps we might ordinarily think. So possibly, even thinking of like cells as, in a sense, having it makes sense to say that they have minds.
Well, it makes sense after you've done the experiments, right? So again, I don't think any of these things, whether any of these things make sense or not, cannot be judged in advance. So
Right.
people sometimes say to me, well, if you're gonna, I'll talk about how we've trained gene regulatory networks and looking at memory and learning in cells and
Mm.
tissues. And I'll say, well, once you go down that road, you might as well say the weather is cognitive. Well, you can't just say it, but I don't know. Did you try training weather systems? Do you know that a hurricane doesn't do habituation or sensitization if you had the right behavioral paradigm? So
Right.
I think it's very common on both sides. The conventional scientists tend to assume that mind doesn't exist in those at those levels, and at this point, there's a ton of empirical evidence that it does. And then you have the other side, which are kind of the more maybe mystical inclined people that say, oh, there's mind everywhere, the solar system is a giant mind, and the universe as a whole.
Right.
Like, maybe, but those kind of protocol claims need evidence to like try it.
Mm.
Take that approach and see how you go. And that I think is very valuable, and it's enabled us and other people in the community to make some very nice new discoveries when you don't assume that things are mechanical, dumb mechanical machines, which I'm not sure if there are any dumb mechanical machines, but if you assume that lens is going to do well for you certainly throughout biology, that lens fails utterly. It leaves so much on the table if you insist on that,
Mm.
taking that perspective below mammals or brainy organisms.
Right. And yeah, okay. And then I wanted to ask around sort of this work you've done on bioelectricity, and then also sort of scale-free frameworks to make sense out of, yeah, the sort of life, or I suppose at different levels of analysis. Um, yeah, for those who perhaps are first like hearing you now, I'll put perhaps some links for a couple of the videos and conversations I found elsewhere, which are useful sort of perhaps introductions into it. But perhaps just are you able to give like a sort of an, I don't know if an elevator pitch is the right phrase, but a very sort of brief account of your work, sort of like with Planera and stuff, and bioelectricity, and the kind of what the finding, the kind of the outcomes of those studies.
Sure. So my big picture claim for this, as far as this topic, is simply that uh, neuroscience is not about neurons. Neuroscience is about the mechanisms that enable competent parts to become larger wholes that know things that their parts don't know. So the reason that you and I know things that our neurons don't know is there's a kind of a cognitive glue mechanism, and that being the electrophysiology that functions across our neurons, that
Mm.
enables the individual neurons, which are also cells and they have lots of individual competencies, but they bind together into this large electrical network, which is able to generate and hold memories, preferences, goals, and so on, that the individual cells don't have. And so that is the magic that we're trying to understand here. That is an amazing process. This is the process by which large-scale minds enter the physical world. Has to do, we are all collective intelligences. We're all made of parts.
Mm.
So this is what we're trying to understand: is where do large-scale intelligences come from? And in terms of novel types of intelligences that we haven't seen before, how do we recognize them? How do we communicate with them? How do we exchange goals? In other words, give them new goals that they may not have had before, and so on. So the model system that we use for this, or one model system that we use for this in our lab, is cells as a collective intelligence, all kinds of cells, not just neurons, but all kinds of cells as a collective intelligence that does interesting things. Now, we as humans that have muscles and brains, we are obsessed with three-dimensional space, and we think of behavior as movement through three-dimensional space. But actually, life has been navigating all kinds of other problem spaces that are really hard for us to visualize. And one of those problem spaces is called anatomical space. So anatomical morphospace is basically the space of all possible shape configurations that your body can take. And there, it's an incredibly large space, but we all make this journey. You start life as one cell, the fertilized egg, and then you traverse that space to become a human shape, or a tree, or a camel, or whatever you're going to be.
Mhm.
So it turns out that process is not a hardwired mechanical process well described by chemistry. It is not. It is actually a navigational process where a collection of cells all share the same vision of where they need to go. Right? It's a story that binds this. Basically, what holds together collectives is a common goal. And so when all of these cells connect in a network, and this is an electrical, chemical, and biomechanical network, that network is able to represent a goal that individual cells can't. But that goal is a particular journey through that anatomical space. And so they undergo that journey, and then you get whatever you are. And so the reason to think about it in this way, as opposed to the conventional kind of this idea of complexity and emergence, that it's just a mechanical system. Every component does mechanical rules, and eventually something complex will pop out. The reason to think about it the way that I suggested is because you then find out that all of the tools that we have in cognitive science and behavior science for manipulating intelligences that navigate spaces, all of those tools now apply in really interesting ways. And so one of the things that we've wanted to do was to see if we can re-specify the goal. So if I'm making the claim that cells in the body are a collective intelligence that navigate towards a specific goal in this space, I need to be able to show you how they remember that goal. So I need to be able to read it. I need to be able to know the mechanism. How do they record it? And I need to be able to rewrite it to show that if I give them a different goal, they will do something different. Right? And that's the way your thermostat in your house works. In order to know that it's some kind of a goal-directed homeostatic system, you have to know that it's that. Then you have to be able to read the set point, and you have to be able to rewrite the set point. Okay, so this is an example of what we did in the Planarian flatworm. So the Planarian flatworm is this little creature. It has a brain. It has a nervous system. It has lots of different organ and tissue types. Fascinating little creature for many reasons that we could talk about. But one of the most amazing things is that if you cut it into pieces, every piece will regrow whatever it's missing, and you get a bunch of perfect little worms. The record is, I think, 256 pieces or 275. I forget what it is. Anyway, and so you can ask a very simple question: having cut it into pieces, how does each piece know what a correct planarian is supposed to look like? And the standard answer is, well, it doesn't know. What it has is a genome, and the genome guides chemical processes that basically just says, whatever comes out, comes out. And so if that were the case, then the prediction from that paradigm would be that, well, then you can't change the outcome without changing the genome, right? The outcome is in some way, and we're used to thinking about it that way. If you say, why do dogs have puppies and cats have kittens? Oh, it's because of their genome. So there's this general thinking that the hardware specification that's in the genome, the micro hardware, I mean, the genome doesn't actually say anything about your overall shape, but it specifies all the proteins. There's some idea that is what determines what you're going to be. So okay, so we developed about 25 years ago, we developed the first tools to read and write electrical information in non-neural tissue. Neuroscientists have been doing it with electrophysiology for a long time. We developed optical methods to do it in non-neural tissue. So we decided to look at these Planarian fragments and see if we can read their mind, quite literally, and to see if we could read out the memories of what a correct Planarian was supposed to look like. And by the way, the reason I say this is a literal interpretation, not some sort of fanciful analogy, is that the exact same mechanisms that our brains use to hold memories and pursue goals are homologous, evolutionarily homologous, meaning exactly the same mechanisms are used all the way down to control morphogenesis. They're conserved. Evolution is reusing ion channels, neurotransmitters, electrical synapses. All of those things are being the reason our brains do it is because evolution learned this trick, a long time ago, around the time of bacterial biofilms. So quite literally, whereas our brains use electrical networks to think about getting around in the three-dimensional world, tissues use those exact same networks to think about getting around in the world of shapes. And so when we looked at these planaria, we saw that we could see the electrical pattern that says one head, one tail. And then we did the obvious thing, is to say, all right, what if we rewrite the pattern? We don't touch the genes. We leave the hardware alone. The hardware is exactly the same, but we're going to give it a stimulus. And the shortest time you can do this is all it takes is 3 hours. Okay. And then for the next 8 or 9 days, they regenerate. So for those 3 hours, we can expose them to a drug which opens a particular ion conductance across the cell membrane. It changes the voltage, and it results in that pattern changing, so that your memory, it's in effect, it's writing a false memory. It's incepting a false memory into the collective intelligence. You used to think that a proper worm has one head, one tail. Now you think it has two heads. Why? Because your memory of what a correct Planarian is supposed to look like has been rewritten. And so we can do that. And so we went in and we rewrote the pattern, and sure enough, they made two-headed worms. And not only that, we then found out that if you cut those two-headed worms again in plain water, no more manipulation, no more drugs, no more nothing, you can keep doing it and doing it and doing it. Every time you cut them, you will continue to get two-headed worms, even though the genome has not been touched. So if you were to sequence the genome, you would see absolutely nothing wrong, and you would make the wrong prediction. You would say, oh, this looks like a perfect wild type, normal worm. And you'd be wrong, because that's not where the information is stored. The information is actually stored in that electrical circuit, which has this amazing memory property. It keeps if you change the pattern, it keeps the pattern. We can change it back. If you want to change it back to one-headed, you can. But so that's one of the things that we were able to do, is to show. Now we did a few other interesting things. First of all, we used drugs like SSRIs to modify the way that the information is interpreted, and you can even drive them into this weird state. The rabbit duck illusion, or the Necker cube. It's like it's a picture where you look at it, and every time you kind of change your perception, right, it flips between two different things. So you can do that. So we made these worms. We call them cryptic worms, and cryptic worms can't quite decide whether they should be one-headed or two-headed. So if you cut it into pieces, every piece flips a coin as to what it's going to do, because that electrical pattern is interpreted one way or another, And so right. and the final thing we did with these worms was to show that they can actually grow heads that belong to other species of flatworms. They grow because all the different species have different shaped brains and heads and so on. And so you can push a Planarian to develop a head from a species that's about 150 million years of evolutionary distance away, without touching the genome, just by changing the memory of what the cells think a proper Planarian should look like.
That's fascinating. And is that then, okay, because then the question becomes, in a way, and I'm not a biologist, but the question then becomes, okay, so well, what then is the function of the genome if it's this manipulating this bioelectricity has such an impact on morphogenesis, also the structure of the body? Though it sounds, because I think you actually just mentioned it, though. You said, I didn't know this, but that the genome doesn't actually even, prior to any of this, that perhaps that there was an understanding that the genome doesn't configure the shape of, there's nothing in the genome to sort of delineate what that organism should end up looking like. It just sort of provides the materials or something, or the process. Is that what you were saying?
Well, so I'm not the one saying it. This was known since when the genetic code was cracked. When you crack a code, you have to show a mapping. Here are what the symbols look like, and here's what they correspond to. So when the genetic code was cracked, and this was now whatever 70 years ago or however long it has been,
yeah,
it was completely obvious that but once it was cracked, of course, it became obvious that what the code stands for is not characters of a shape. There's nothing in the code that says these are eyes and this is what they're shaped like and these are
Mm,
tails and these are limbs. That's not what they code for. The genes code for proteins. And
mm,
so proteins are the tiniest level hardware that you have inside your cells. And
right.
so the genome is very important. I'm not saying it's not important. You have to, if you don't have the hardware, then whatever algorithms you plan to run are frozen in the sort of Platonic space of algorithms. They're not in the physical world. You need hardware. So if somebody says to you, I have the most amazing code, but you don't have a computer to run it, what's the what, you're not going to get any use out of it. So the genome is absolutely critical to provide the hardware, and the hardware
Yeah.
is cells that have ion channel proteins, and they have all the chemical machinery to stay alive and metabolism and all this other stuff. So the genome is important, but what's critical is that the process of going from a genome to an organism is not a mechanical process. It is not a hardwired process. It is a process of intelligent sense making of both the genetic information and the environment. Morphogenesis, meaning the production of a body or the regeneration of a body, or metamorphosis, like from caterpillar to butterfly, or repair,
Mm,
or any of that stuff. What it is a collective intelligence of cells and actually molecular networks, because they too are a collective intelligence, trying to make sense of the information that they have. And what information do they have? Well, they have genetic information from their ancestors, they have environmental inputs from whatever environment they're in, and they're trying to make the best, most adaptive outcome they can given the information they have. It's a creative problem solving process. And
right.
so that's the new claim, right? Everybody already knew that the genome doesn't directly code for features, but what people said is, well, uh, what people like the word emergence. They would say, well, it specifies chemical interactions between parts, and if you do that enough, something complex will emerge out of it.
Yeah.
Fair
By
enough.
magic. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, what emergence really means, I don't like the word at all, because what it really tends to suggest is surprise. That's what it means. If
Yeah.
something is emergent, that means we didn't see it coming. We were surprised. And if
Mm,
you weren't surprised, then you could see that it was obvious. Then it's no longer emergence. Or once you figure
mm,
out why it works, then you don't call it emergence anymore. So I don't find that super useful. But the real question is, so for example, if it were a simple feed forward process like that, right, where everything follows local laws and then you just get what you get, then you couldn't rewrite the set point. Then it would be really hard to change what it makes. It would always try to make the same
right.
thing, and you couldn't change it because it doesn't say anything about the eyes or the symmetry type or the limbs or anything else. But we are now showing in a number of contexts that, yeah, absolutely, it has encoded goals in anatomical space, and you can rewrite them. And then that same hardware is happy to build. So the human genome can build humans. It can also build anthrobots, which we've made.
Mm,
The frog genome can make frogs. It can also make xenobots. Who knows what else it can make? I think the space of possibilities is enormous,
yeah.
and all of this is a sense making process.
It's really, yeah, it's fascinating as well when you mentioned the worms that you've managed to get the worms to grow heads of other species, of which some are from like 150 million years ago. And so that really does then speak. Is that what you said?
Yeah, but it's not that they're 150 million years ago. It's that because all of these things are evolving at the same time, right? It's that there's 150 million years of evolutionary distance between these species, meaning that they split
That
off, right? They've been evolving separately for 100 to 150 million years.
right, right. Though the organism you've manipulated, it's ended up with a, I don't know if we'd say phenotype or an out of some sort of structure akin to or equivalent to an organism which split off 150 million years ago.
Correct, but they
As in,
exist now. But they exist now.
yeah, right, 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 right. Okay,
So
yeah, yeah,
they're
yeah,
not
yeah, yeah,
ancient. I'm not turning them into some sort of ancient worm.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
turning
yeah,
them
yeah.
into a different species that is also
Yeah.
a current species.
But the split off point took place around 150 million years ago.
Something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, yeah, yeah, that's fascinating, and that does sort of, yeah. So, and it sounds like that's how you're thinking of it. Is this kind of idea of like, I don't know how you even space is the right word, but like a latent space of possibilities. And I think you are sensitive. Am I right of this sort of like, suppose in a sense, platonic forms, and that actually what's going on here is these organisms are sort of feeling their way into some sort of realm of possibilities as to what they could be.
Yeah, I mean, so up until recently, I was only talking about the latent space of anatomies that existed as there are attractors in that space, and there are specific shapes
Mm,
that that can be assembled in that space. And up until recently, the conversation was around, well, evolution shapes the space, right? In other words, the reason that frogs have a particular shape and behavior is because of eons of selection that basically killed off everything else, and whatever remains is a viable region of that latent space that uh, can is compatible with the environment, right? That's the
mm,
but since then so we've moved past that, because we've been making xenobots and anthrobots and various things that have never existed before. And so the benefit of doing that is that you can really start to talk about a platonic space that's different from the physical space, because there is no eons of selection that establishes an anthrobot's properties. There's never been any anthrobots. There's never been selection
mm.
to be a good anthrobot. Where do their properties come from? And so again, some people who want a very sparse ontology will say, don't talk about these non-physical spaces. We'll just call it emergent. We'll just say that these are weird patterns that emerge. They're just facts that hold in the physical world. So if you want to do that, you can, but it prevents discovery, because it basically lands you in this place of making a catalog of surprising emergent facts. When you come across one, you say, well, that's funny, here's another weird thing that holds in our world, and you sort of write it down and you end up with this catalog. But I don't that isn't science.
Mm.
Science rests on the optimistic assumption that that space of possibilities is an ordered, structured space. It's not just a bunch of random surprising facts. And that, of course, I can't prove that. It's a metaphysical assumption. But if you want to do science, the optimistic assumption is that it's going to be an ordered space, and that we can have a principled science of systematically investigating that space. And from that
Mm.
perspective, everything we make, anthrobots, xenobots, cells, tissues, embryos, robots, AIs, well, whatever, everything we make is an interface onto that space. It's an exploration vehicle. It's a tool that you can, among other things, that you can use to explore that space. Yeah, and I take it very seriously. I think that space is absolutely real. In whatever real means, I think that space is real.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I suppose unless one's read him, it might not make sense. But I've recently been reading Arthur Schopenhauer, and actually,
Mm,
like it maps onto that a lot, because he was a Platonist in a sense, and
mm,
he was sort of well known for his idea of the will, of this sort of kind of like substrate, which was just sort of trying to like strive forward and manifest. But
mm.
actually, he drew a lot on like Schopenhauer and that sort of life forms, sort of almost like, yeah, these
Sorry, who?
archetypes.
Sorry, who?
Schopenhauer, Arthur
Yeah,
Arthur
who
Schopenhauer.
drew? Yeah, sure, but who? You said somebody drew on Schopenhauer. Who was it that drew on Schopenhauer?
Sorry, no, Schopenhauer drew on Plato.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay, all right. Yeah,
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 and that the will is just sort of striving forward to try and fulfill itself, like fulfill
yeah,
these forms, or in a
yeah.
sense.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm not a historian or a scholar of the history of philosophy, but I'm very sympathetic to that. In the way that I've said it is that I think the content of that space is under positive pressure. I think these patterns are. I think they want to get into the physical world, and I don't think you need to work very hard to make that happen. You have to provide, like with anything that has a positive pressure, you make an interface, and out it comes. And I think that's a
mm,
good description of what's happening here. I think there is, I don't know if we want to call it a force but just a tendency, a very strong tendency of these forms to ingress into the physical world whenever an appropriate interface is made. And I don't think it takes much at all. One of the most amazing things that I think we found in our work is that if you want competencies to come into the world that are easily recognized as kinds of intelligence, it doesn't take much at all. I mean, it doesn't take cells, it doesn't take living material. We've shown simple things like this happening in very simple sorting algorithms. So deterministic, short computer algorithms that have been studied by computer scientists for, I don't know, 60 years or more, where you see what the algorithm is telling them to do. And yeah, they do that. But if you know how to look, you also see that they're doing other things at the same time. They're doing these weird side quests that are easily recognizable as things like delayed gratification and other things that are basically simple cognitive properties. And And this happens. You don't need quantum. You don't need the quantum interface for this. You don't need complexity. You don't. It's amazing how little you actually need.
Yeah, interesting. Um, and I know, your focus is on, I think anyway, like kind of like, you're a scientist and you're interested in actually sort of like, yeah, what can we achieve? What can we manipulate? How, doing experiments and seeing where that takes us. But as I said before, I'm kind of like interested in like the kind of philosophical, where at least the questions it poses. And one of them, if you could speak on this idea of like cognitive light cone you've spoken about. And in a way, I think it's perhaps somewhat uh, it's an idea, I guess, maybe that's shared by, yeah, philosophers from the past, and in a way, it kind of makes me think similar to Don Hoffman's interface theory.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
Mm-hmm.
see like that resonance there with that? Like, is
Yeah.
it if you, yeah,
Yeah. I see. Yes, I think what I'm saying is very compatible with Don's theory, and as far as the cognitive light cone itself, where that came from was an attempt to formalize what I think all agents have in common. In other words,
right,
if you if you don't worry about either implementation, meaning what is it made of, what's the scale at which it works, right? If you abstract over that, and you don't worry about origin story, meaning was it evolved, was it engineered, what, or some hybrid, what do all agents have in common? So we're talking about, of course, natural animals, but also cells and tissues and alien life and synthetic life forms and AIs, software and
mm,
robotic, like all of it. What do they all have in common? And so, what I think keeps an agent together are the goals that it can pursue. And one way to analyze the space of possible agents is to look at the first of all the scale of the goals that they can pursue, and the space into which they can project those goals. But let's just take physical space for a moment. Um, you can ask what's the spatiotemporal size of the biggest goal you can pursue. So if you tell
mm,
me that the only thing you can care about, the only thing you're capable of caring about is the sugar concentration within a 10 micron region of spacetime, and you have 20 minutes memory going backwards and a few minutes anticipatory potential forwards, and all of it is harnessed to maintaining a particular sugar gradient, then I'm going to say you're probably a bacterium. If you tell me that you're capable of being concerned about a region that's some number of hundreds of yards, but you're never going to care about what happens the next town over 3 weeks from now, I'm going to say you might be a dog. If you're a dog, you have a certain cognitive light cone. You're never going to care what happens, next month.
mm,
It's impossible, or what happened last month.
mm,
But you have more memory, and you can sort of, you've got an area that you can sort of think about. And if you tell me that you're interested in the state of world peace hundreds of years from now, long after you're gone, on all over the globe, all over the earth, if you can really do that, I'm going to say you might be a human. and
mm,
and if you tell me that you can care for, in the linear range, not just abstractly, but in the linear range, care for all of the living beings on the planet, I'm going to say you can't be a human. We're not able to do that. You must be something else, some kind of bodhisattva or something that is
right,
actually able to generate that level of actual active compassion. So the size of your goals, the things that you can actively pursue as goal states, the things that stress you out. But if you tell me what stresses you out, I can pretty much tell where you are on that spectrum. Uh, so that's the point of the cognitive light cone. It's to try to give us a way to kind of compare very diverse intelligences. But there's much
I
more to it,
see.
because you also have to, many of these intelligences aren't working in three-dimensional space, so you have to project these light cones in all kinds of weird spaces, like anatomical space, gene expression space, physiological state space. Who knows what other spaces different kind of agents
Yeah.
are working.
Um, and it's just come to my mind, so I don't forget. Coming back to the bioelectricity, so you cited how it's been done with Planera. I mean, have you had thoughts as to kind of, or is there evidence to suggest that, what scale that can go to in terms of like size of organisms?
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing specific about the size of organisms, and we know this because in an elephant's brain, I don't know how big it is, I'm sure it's very large. In an elephant's brain, the identity of the elephant as a self is held together by bioelectricity across a meter of distance. And we know we've done work in Planera, we've done work in frogs, we've done work in human cells, although not the human patients yet, but certainly human cells and tissues.
Mm,
Uh,
mm,
it's all the same. Evolution reuses it
right.
exactly the same, and it maybe even more interestingly, and the reason I know this for the human case is that this is why we are doing biomedicine, right? It's because these things they're not. This is not just a story about Planera. This is a story about how you communicate with cells and tissues, which is basically the rate limiting step for biomedicine. The thing that's holding back radical regenerative medicine is our inability to communicate with cells and tell them what we want them to build. And the
Right.
first step of being able to do that is recognizing that you are in fact dealing with a collective intelligence, not a mechanical object that you're going to micromanage. It's a communication task. So dealing with it's not a 3D printing task. It's a communication task. And so that's how we do the biomedicine. But even more interestingly than that, I think the bioelectrics are holding together individual cells within an embryo. Okay, so they're a cognitive glue that binds together within an embryo. But as of last year, we now know that even individuals, so individual embryos in a petri dish, talk to each other electrically to help everybody complete that morphogenetic journey. So we've actually shown that it's actually a glue on the population scale too. I'm not saying that works for humans. I have no idea, but in the case of frog embryos, we have shown that it's a multi-scale phenomenon. It works between cells,
Mm.
and it also works between individual animals.
So this might speak to my naivety. I mean, so to what degree then does this kind of change the grand narratives within biology that have existed? You know, for example, I mean, what's it referred to as? Is it the great synthesis? Basically, the idea that evolution is predicated on natural selection and Mendelian sort of, is that what it's referred to as? Like something like the great synthesis or something?
Yeah, I mean the great synthesis pulls together biochemistry, genetics, evolution, paleontology. It's this idea that you can that all of these things come together, right? That you can use biochemistry
Oh,
and
okay.
genetics to understand what's going on in evolution, and all of that comes together with
I see.
paleontological
So
evidence, right?
right, right. And so then this just sort of this kind of work and these findings, it's sort of like, I guess it's about integrating that into, um, yeah, dynamics which were previously identified as being central to, um, I don't know, like morphogenesis, for example, like, yeah, genes and stuff.
I think it's a little different than that. I think what's important about what I mean, the minimal interpretation of what we do is that okay, they found a new set of physical processes, namely bioelectricity, that we have to worry about when we think about evolution and development. That's the minimal
Mm.
version of it, and that's the conventional view of it. I think that's not nearly the why this is important. I think the real importance of this is that what I'm saying is that there are deep and powerful and very practically important symmetries between mind and life. In other words, that the problem of self-organization of life is exactly the problem of how minds come into the physical world. That I think there are huge invariants between cognitive science and the science of the mind and the science of the body. They're the same thing, and you
It's
know
interesting.
Alan Turing, who was a guy who was, of course, instrumental and as a pioneer of understanding programmability, computation, intelligence in other substrates. He was really interested in artificial intelligence and things like that. He also, toward the end of his life, he wrote a very famous paper on chemical systems self-organizing in embryonic development. Right, and this the Turing patterns that were named after him.
Oh,
And so you might ask that question: why would somebody who's interested in intelligence and programmability and computing, why would he be looking at how chemicals organize themselves in development? And I think he was onto this, and I think if he had lived, he would have said it. He didn't come out and say it, but I think he would have, that the problem of the formation of the mind and the formation of the body is really the same problem, and that I don't believe that there are many implications. I mean, we can, if you want, we can talk about this. I can tell you what the implications are for evolution, for example. But there are many implications for biology of the idea that it's intelligence all the way down. Evolution does not work on a mechanical material; it works on an agential material, and it's completely different. Looking at how evolution works on an agential material is very different than if it was a passive material, the way we engineer with Legos and wood and things like that. So that's the key. I think what's different here is that we did not wait until birds and mammals showed up to have intelligence. It was intelligence at the origin of life. There was already, and in fact, before that, I mean, I think the set of cognitive things is wider than the set of living things. But certainly what life does is magnify like crazy. It magnifies the scaling of the cognitive Lightcone from very simple systems to the kinds of complex things we see today.
Yeah, I mean, please do feel to carry on that, because that's really interesting. And when you say agential, in a sense, I mean, would that be equivalent to intentional? So almost as though there's like an intention all the way down. Is that, I suppose, or am I just complicating things in the sense of like when you say agential, what do you mean by that, I suppose?
What I mean is that you're dealing with a material that has its own agendas, meaning that it's capable of doing homeostatic loops minimally, meaning it's capable of having goals. That's
Mm.
the kind of the simplest way to have a goal, is to have a homeostatic loop, and then you can add on top of that all kinds of capacities for learning, for preferences, for solving intelligence. I like the definition of intelligence that comes from William James, which is the ability to get to the same goal by different means. So how
Hmm.
much creative problem solving can you muster to get to your goal in whatever space you're working in, to get to your goal when things change, when there's a barrier between you and your goal. How much, how good are you at getting around and still getting your goals met? That's intelligence. And even molecular networks, never mind cells or anything like that, even simple molecular networks are able to have 6 different kinds of learning, including Pavlovian conditioning. And they do things like integrated information goes up when they learn. So this is something we discovered this year, is that causal emergence, the way that people like Tononi and others measure in human patients and in others, to understand to what extent is a system more than the sum of its parts. Even
Hmm.
molecular networks do this. It goes all the way down, and it's a free gift from mathematics. You don't need physics for this. It doesn't come from the physical universe. It's a free gift from the math. And what we call alive, are systems that exploit the hell out of that feature to build more and more higher and higher agential systems. But it goes all the way down.
Yeah. So when you say it goes all the way down, this is like maybe getting quite speculative, but it does make one wonder. Then, to what extent does it? Like, where are we on that kind of like
Sure,
ladder, so to
sure, sure,
speak?
sure.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's very hard. I think it's very hard to recognize systems above us. I mean, it's certainly hard to recognize systems below us, but I think it's also very
Right.
hard to recognize above. I had we have an amazing graphic artist, Jeremy Gay, who does things for us, and I had him draw this diagram where there's 2 neurons in a brain having a conversation, and the first
Mm.
neuron is a kind of a materialist skeptic, and he says to the other neuron, he says, the universe doesn't care about us. It's just chemistry. It just evolves according to chemical rules, and it's cold and unfeeling, and nothing means anything.
Mm.
We're just, and the other neuron is a little bit of a mystic, and he says, well, I can't prove it, but I kind of feel like our world has its own goals and patterns and memories, and when we get rewarded or punished with these electrical waves that come across us, and all this stuff, I feel like it has its own mind, and that's ridiculous. That can't be right. And of course, in their scenario, it's the mystic that's correct, because they are in fact part of a universe that is not a dumb mechanical thing. It does have goals and memories and preferences that these neurons know absolutely nothing about, and the patterns of electrical activity that sweep across them, which are painful and whatever, there is a reason for it. And if the first one claims that these are just things that happen, they mean nothing, they're not they're not purposeful, he's wrong. In that case, he's wrong. So factually wrong. So the question is, right, the patterns that we see in the universe, the patterns of our lives, is it the same thing? And so some people say yes, of course, obviously, and they said, well, that's nice, and certainly we should be open to that possibility. You can't just assume it. And so we can ask the question of, what would it take to to gather evidence for it. I don't. My suspicion is there's some sort of Gödel thing that will say why we can't ever prove it, but I bet we could gather evidence for it. And when people ask me what that evidence would look like, I think it would look like synchronicity. I think it would look like patterns that have no meaningful connection at the level of physics, but they do have a connection at the level of meaning for cognitive beings. And so
Right.
if there are patterns like that, and of course, and these things are extremely difficult to study. It's very hard to prove anything here, to kind of in any strong way.
Mm.
But that's what I think it would look like. If you are a part of a larger system that has goals that you don't know anything about, you will have these kind of synchronistic events that you can't come up with a physics explanation for, but that have a meaning on a larger scale if you can fathom it. And that, of course, depends on what kind of intelligence you have and imagination and creativity in order to communicate with this, no doubt, very alien large scale intelligence.
That's really interesting. Particularly as I'm quite a fan of Carl Jung as well, so that yeah, it's quite interesting. But yeah, and so maybe just lastly, sort of on this kind of you well, okay, so you alluded to cancer, and then sort of tying together what we've just spoken about, or you've sort of shared around, I suppose, in a sense of kind of like to me the way it's like life is like a sort of mereological, it's this kind of like parts whole all kind of like built going up, right, at different levels. It's like cells actually almost in a sense, um how would you say, they're a part of a whole, right? But then they communicate in order for that whole to exist or to function, they need to communicate effectively. And my understanding is that like cancer, for example, is where there's a breakdown in communication between cells. That's the first question I have. Is that correct with your sort of like the bioelectricity, that there's a kind of a breakdown in the understanding of between that cell and what the sort of the greater whole it's a part of almost?
Yeah, that's right. That's how I think is a very useful way to see cancer as literally a dissociative identity disorder. So if you look at the cognitive light cone of unicellular organisms, in individual cells have very tiny cognitive light cones. All they care
Mm,
about is the metabolic state inside that cell. The rest of
mm,
the world, the rest of the body to them is outside environment. So the reason that there's ever anything but cancer is that there are electrochemical and other networks that bind individual cells into a kind of mind meld where there's a network and the network overrides the individual goals of the individual cells and
right.
can store very large set points. When the salamander limb is amputated and the cells very rapidly rebuild the limb and then they stop, individual cells have no idea what a finger is or how many fingers you're supposed to have. Individual cells don't know anything about that, but the collective absolutely does, because it knows when you deviate from it and it knows when it reaches it. So, and that's why they stop. So the collective intelligence knows what a limb is supposed to look like. So in embryogenesis and of course in evolution, you have this amazing scale up of cognitive light cones where initially you start with this tiny little your tiny little set of goals, and then you end up being part of something that pursues these really grandiose goals, these massive construction projects that you can't even begin to understand
Mm,
what you're building. And so when that process breaks down, it's that's what we call cancer, because then what happens is for an individual cell, the cognitive light cone shrinks, and
mhm,
it's not that it's any more selfish. It's not less cooperative. It's not more selfish. It just has a smaller self. The
mm,
boundary between self and world shrinks. And so now, as
mm,
far as that cell is concerned, the rest of the body is just outside environment. So it will do what all unicellulars do. In fact, what all agents do. It will look out for its own interests. It will go eat what it wants. It will go, travel where it wants, and that's metastasis. It will reproduce as much as it can, right? So metastatic behavior. So that's what we see in cancer, and we can see that happening. So when you put in nasty human oncogenes into let's say a tadpole, first thing that happens is the cells electrically disconnect from their neighbors and they depolarize, and you can see the electrical change. And so this is part of a diagnostic technology that we're working on to be able to see the early stages of that process. We use a voltage reporting technology that shows us when cells are disconnecting. And then the more important thing is, well, can we use this crazy way of thinking about cancer to actually do a therapeutic? And so on that theory, it's not about killing the cells. It's not about fixing the genetic defect. It's about reconnecting it to the network. And we've done that. We've done it in the frog model, and we're now doing it in human tissues. So
It's so, yeah. So it's so fascinating because, you know, thinking about this idea of like levels of scaling upwards, and it is speculative, but I can't, those dynamics you speak of, I can't help but see resonance with some work in sort of psychological theory, particularly work coming out of kind of like, it's just, I mean, psychodynamic now, there's a plurality of ideas, but one is this sort of, well, it's actually perhaps also part of a broader, I think, movement to see psychopathology as being more systemic. So rather than previously identifying it as sort of, you know, like, it resides within the individual, and that in order for the person to become healthy again, we must sort of focus merely at the level of the individual. But basically, it comes from mentalization-based theory, and it's there's this guy called Peter Fonagy, or yeah, Peter Fonagy, UCL, and his colleagues. And basically, what they're suggesting is that psychopathology can be perhaps a proxy for it is the degree to which individuals have their levels of epistemic trust. So that, you know, so the higher level of epistemic mistrust, so the degree which essentially in a way is a kind of is the degree to which a person is willing to learn or receive information from the social environment. So, you know, the higher levels of or what we might say is more chronic psychopathology is where people have a kind of a complete breakdown in their it's referred to like epistemic hypervigilance, or sort of they're just completely unable to make sense of information from other agents. And actually, therefore, in order for that, it's not just about sort of fixing the person's problems, but it's about trying to help that person reintegrate into the sort of wider system of like of the community, of the human community, by improving their epistemic trust, so that they can, you know, across time, yeah, sort of make sense out of yeah, it's just interesting. It's quite, as I say, it's a bit tangential, but yeah, it's interesting. It's that sort of ability to learn, I suppose.
yeah, it is interesting. And we have I should connect you. I've got a student in my lab, Jordan Strasser, who's actually working on a paper on those parallels, trying to flesh out those parallels between cancer and aspects of psychology and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think there's a lot here. You know, I think there are a lot of a lot of parallels that may have clinical relevance someday. You know.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, interesting. Okay, well, I'm mindful of the time, but yeah, no, thanks so much, Mike.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I've really
Yeah.
enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Excellent.